Do you want to sit up here, Julie or Robert, today?
Are we broadcasting? Yes. Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Ealing Schools Forum, the November session. We have a number of old faces and a few new faces. So I'm going to start with introductions, probably a bit longer than normal, but I think it's important to. And before we do that, Cornelia or Isabel, do we elect first, or it seems a pity to not introduce people first on the agenda? It's not on the agenda. Oh.
I think it continues for the. I think it's fine. I think it continues for the moving years. Okay. Your re-elections happen.
Okay, so we'll start the meeting with with introductions. My name is Paul Adair. I'm the chair of Ealing Schools Forum, and we'll go left.
I'm Isabel Robb. I'm the clerk of Ealing School Forums.
I'm Susan Dillon, Twinkle Tots Day Nursery PVIs.
Hi everyone, I'm Iman Basuroy, head teacher from a primary school, and it's my first attendance today, so
I'm Marion, head teacher at Northolt High School, and please eat the chocolates that were given by a member of staff to me that I want to share. So they're coming round, so please eat those.
Wow, how do I follow that?
Sorry.
I'm Louise Troy. I'm the chair of governors at South Acton Nursery School and Children's Centre, and this is my first Ealing Schools Forum. So pleased to meet you all.
Ian Buchanan. I'm vice chair of governors at Spring Hallows School.
I'm Harshi Patel. I'm the head teacher at Acton Gardens Primary School. It's my first meeting.
Hi, I'm Jamie Malloy. I'm the head teacher at Grange Primary School in South Ealing. I've just been re-elected my third term. You can thank me later.
Hi, I'm John Hicks. I'm the head of Ealing Primary Centre and representing pupil referral units.
Hi, my name's John Bailey. I'm the co-head at Havelock Primary School, and it's my first meeting.
Stephen Sims, District Secretary from the NEU, but representing the NSUWT, the NEU, the NHT and ASCL.
My name's David Bone. I'm the chair of governors at Derwent Water. This is my first meeting.
I'm Jeremy Hannay. I'm the vice chair of the Schools Forum and the head at Three Bridges in Southall.
Wendy Smith, chair of governors at Three Bridges in Southall.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Councillor Charan Sharma.
Hi, Aretha Banton, assistant director for SEND and inclusion for Ealing.
Hi everyone, I'm Julie Lewis. I'm the director for learning standards and school partnerships.
Kim Price, head of education planning, resources and sustainability at the council.
And Tamara Quinn, assistant director for planning and resources.
And we have some colleagues online. If you could introduce us, starting with Charlotte.
Hello, I'm Charlotte Haynes. I'm head teacher at Brankside High School. Just beginning my second, can't think what the word is, term. There you go, on Schools Forum.
Mia.
Hi, I'm Mia Pye. I'm head teacher at Greenford High School.
Chris.
Hi, I'm Chris Richards, head teacher at Villiers High School in Southall.
Roisin.
Hi, I'm Roisin Walsh, head teacher of Dormers Wells High School. Apologies, my camera's not working.
And Kimberly.
Hi, I'm Kimberly Herring. So I'm head of the academy, work for ARC.
Thank you. And Vanessa, I think, has just arrived. Hi, Vanessa. Okay, so we have got a very full forum tonight, which is wonderful. We put a lot of effort into recruiting, and a big thank you to Cornelia, who has worked tirelessly. Cornelia is handing the reins over to Isabel. And I don't know, is this your last meeting? Will you be here at the next one? Okay, but I just want to put on record, my thanks to Cornelia. She's a terrific support to Schools Forum and to me, and to keep coming whenever you like.
You can watch live from home.
I know. So we're moving on to apologies. We have apologies from. We don't have any apologies. Oh,
Emma, Robert.
Oh, Emma. Sorry, Emma. Is this the largest school forum in the world? With apologies from Emma Appleby, Irim Woolley, and Sajid? Yeah.
At the college.
And Pete Broadbent. Apologies? Apologies from Tony George.
Can I jump in? She's at the No Learner Left Behind Leadership and Diversity launch, so she thought she might be late or not be able to come.
Okay. So moving on to, just before we move on with the agenda, just in terms of welcoming new forum members, as I said in the pre-meeting, please feel free to ask questions, not too many, but feel free to ask a few questions. There is a lot of jargon and it is very challenging at times to keep up with the pace. So we need to be cognizant of that as we go through the meeting, and don't be afraid to ask any questions if any of the language gets too complex. Moving on to urgent matters. I don't think there's any urgent matters to discuss. No matters to be considered in private. Declarations of interest.
I'm on the National Executive for the NHT. I don't know if that counts.
Okay, it's good to know. The minutes from the previous meeting. So page 3. Page 4, any comments? Page 5, any comments? Page 6, any comments? Page 7. Page 8. And page 9. Happy to agree those minutes? Okay. Thank you. Membership, we've welcomed the membership, the new members. I don't think we have any vacancies now. I think there is a non-maintained SEN. Okay, we'll just note that and carry that on. I don't think this room will fit anybody else. But yeah, just one vacancy for non-maintained SEN. And over to the main body of the meeting, the Schools Forum reports. I'll hand over to Kim and Tamara.
Okay. So the November meeting of the forum follows a funding consultation that's run in the autumn term, which went out to schools. The purpose of this meeting is to, where we can, make decisions about budgets for the next financial year, both for schools but also for the local authority as well. There are some decisions around budgets that are for the local authority, but we consult with schools on those decisions. And so feedback is welcome through this, but also through the consultation that we've held. And those items are often noting. And the decisions that are for agreement and approval by Schools Forum are set out in the recommendations. Some of the decisions will be voted on by sector. So some decisions are for maintained schools only. Some decisions are for primary and secondary school, but we'll take you through those as we go through the meeting. The early years timing is slightly different from the other 3 blocks of the school's funding arrangements. And so there's an update around early years, but there will be decisions that will be made in the spring, and it will come back to the January meeting. So I think we'll move on to the recommendations. Kim will take us through the report.
Okay, so recommendation 1 is to note an update on early years funding, and that the authority will seek approval on elements of the early years funding formula in January. So these are set out on page 17 of the report. And there's a few sort of key things I'll just highlight on that area. So there's an update on the rollout of the childcare reforms, which continued in September with the introduction of the working parent offer for under 2s. And the early headcount information shows a strong uptake of that, so higher than initial estimates. There's an update on the capital funding, so 2 bits of capital funding, an allocation for wraparound provision, and some grant funding for school-based nurseries, for expansion of school-based nurseries. And so that information's been sort of communicated with schools, and there's no process for applying where schools are interested in that. So if schools are interested in the capital funding for expanding school-based nursery places, the deadline for applying for that is the 19th of December, and Leah Forgals Cooper is the contact where schools want to are interested in that funding. The local authority are waiting for updates from the DfE on the estimates for the early years block, so it's easier with some of the other blocks to without some of those funding updates to make decisions on what might happen for next year. Early years block, there's a lot of change because of those entitlements being rolled out. So they're awaiting those announcements, but we'll be going out for a consultation later on this month or early next month. So that consultation is largely on the decisions that Schools Forum will need to make in January. So the 2 key decisions that Schools Forum will need to make will be around what's known as the pass-through, which is effectively the proportion of the funding that's passed through to providers and the proportion that's held centrally. And then on the spread of the central spend. A key thing to note on the pass-through is that the early years block is getting larger as these new entitlements are rolled out. So the pass-through has always been 95% for as long as I can remember, but that's changing. So for this year, the maximum pass-through will be 96%. So hang on, get that around. So we will have to pass through at least 96% of the formula. So the holdback reduces to 4%, and the intention is to change that to a 97% pass through once the entitlements are fully rolled out. So that will all be set out in the consultation, and the recommendation will be to retain the maximum amount centrally as it has been previously, so to pass through that 96%. But yeah, that is a change and needs to be modelled through. As I say, that consultation will launch, so possibly end of this month, probably start of next month, and to ask for views from schools and from the sector on those recommendations, and then the decision will come back to the January forum. So in the January forum, the proposed funding formula will be set out, and we'll seek approval on the pass-through and the central spend.
Okay, could I just ask, what's the 4% that is held back for? You said
so there are a number of elements, and those are set out and they're consulted on as well. So there is the kind of the processing of, so the portals, the finance processing, quality assurance. There's a small amount, I think, around speech and language. And so there are a handful of amounts. They've been broadly similar each year, so they'll be familiar once you have the information in front of you. But essentially there are economies of scale because the local authority, the work is the same, and we've automated a lot of the processes. So it's appropriate that the amount to retain doesn't stay at 5% as the block increases, that it comes down over time. But there are additional costs associated also with having potentially more providers, but more families to engage with and support in accessing provision. and the types of provision are much more varied that will be available in the sector, and so that comes at a cost as well.
So if we move on from that recommendation, so that's no recommendation, just to note that update. If we move on to recommendation 2, so now we're moving on to talk about the schools block and the high needs block. So first with the schools block, so recommendation 2 is to note an update on schools block funding formula allocations and consider the proposed funding formula factors to be used in the next financial year. So this is covered on pages 18 to 20 of the report. At the time of writing the report, we were waiting on the government announcements in terms of the budget. So normally, forum members might remember, in a normal financial cycle, the initial announcements are made in July. That's all been disrupted this year because of the election and new government. So the first kind of sight of those announcements was the 30th of October, just after we finished writing this report. And we're still waiting for some of the detail on that, but we do know more than we did when I wrote this report. So effectively, there's very little change in terms of the funding formula for 25-26. The key thing that was announced in terms of funding on the 30th of October was that there's an additional 2.3 billion for schools this year, which on paper sounds great. But actually a lot of that funding, so they announced it as 2.3 billion for schools, 1 billion for high needs. Actually, the 1 billion for high needs is within the 2.3 billion, not additional to it. So it's effectively 1 billion for high needs and 1.3 billion for schools. Within that 1.3 billion, the large amount of that is effectively funding the continuation of what was called the core school budget grant this year. So the core school budget grant was the funding that was announced in the summer to fund the 5.5% teacher pay award and also the support staff increases for the year. So for this year, for the large part, schools had that for it was covering a September to March period. For next year, obviously, you'll have the full year effect of that teacher pay award. So they'd already announced that funding would cover the full year effect next year. But actually, that 1.3 billion, a large amount of that is to fund that. So it's not additional money, it's already what was already assumed. There is a small amount of additional money within that for an increase in formula factors, but that increase is relatively small. So as well as the wrapping in of the grants, the increase only amounts to around 0.5% increase in formula factors. So the grants that were separate last year are all being wrapped into the formula. But a lot of that is just moving funding that schools were getting via grant last year into the main funding formula. And the actual sort of additional increases is the full year effect of that core school budget grant and then between 0 and 1% increases on the formula factors. The government have also said, so another thing that was announced in that budget was that there would be an increase in employer national insurance contributions. So they've said that there will be additional funding for schools to cover that. So it will be a grant funding in addition to the national funding formula to cover that. So that is something that they have confirmed. They've also mentioned that 1.3 billion will cover increases to pupil premium, which suggests there's going to be an increase in the pupil premium allocation amounts per pupil, but we don't yet know what that is. So government have said, or DfE have said, they're in the process of calculating and expect to make further announcements and issue the full guidance by the end of November. They have issued a summary policy document, which gives an indication of what those national funding formula values are at a national level. Although it's not yet confirmed, we don't know yet things like what Ealing's area cost adjustment is going to be, which impacts on how much funding that funding formula translates to for Ealing. So there are still a number of unknowns. As I say, we do know that the grants are being wrapped in, and bottom of page 18 and top of page 19 explains how that will happen. It's similar to how they've wrapped in grants previously. And then on page 19, there's a table summarising what's happening with the pupil numbers. So obviously one of the key drivers to the amount of funding schools get and the local authority get in the schools block are the number of pupils at the October census. So we've seen, as schools will be aware, we've seen pupil numbers beginning to drop. And so the table sets out that the pupil numbers, the data is provisional at this stage, but the drop in the total is around between 550 and 600 children. So that's that drop of the schools who've had reductions in numbers will see the drop in funding related to that, and it also has some implications for some of the other decisions we'll come on to later, where those amounts are based on a per pupil funding amount. So effectively that drop represents a drop of around 3.5 million in the block value before you then factor in the increases for the grants, etc. Yeah. So that's probably that's the main kind of message in terms of the what's been announced by the government to date. Recommendation 3. Yep.
I just want to check, does anybody want to ask any questions, or because it's a lot of information to take?
Thank you. I've got a question. It's about this in-year funding, and I'm not sure if it's relevant here, so tell me, we'll cover it later. But the early years budget grant, I don't believe is coming into the authority until this month at some point.
Yeah, end of November, yeah.
Yeah, and we were told by our finance bursar that the council was going to make an advance payment to cover salaries in November, teachers pay increased salaries in November. Is that still the case? I just wanted to get that validated so I could take that back with me.
It's a question that a number of schools have raised. It's probably not a matter for Forum, but cash flow is a challenge for all schools. So schools have flagged that they're concerned about all the back pay coming out in 1 month, and we've asked accountancy to ensure that any funding that we have received for those is paid, so that it comes in at the same time. I think if you have particular concerns, if you contact Kim Away outside of the meeting, any individual schools, because most schools will be fine. A lot of schools have balances. It particularly impacts those schools that have tighter budgets or in deficit.
Okay, so it won't be in advance. You'll wait for the funding to come unless we raise it to you.
That's ordinarily what happens. Yeah. I think if you drop us a line outside of the meeting, we can follow that up for you. But we don't ordinarily pay money out to schools that we haven't received ourselves. For the same reason you guys experience cash flow issues, the local authority has to manage its treasury as well.
Okay, no other comments? Yeah, I just had 2 questions. You talked about the funding that's been proposed has covered support staff as well as teacher pay awards. Mm-hmm. Is that an ongoing? Because historically that hasn't been the case, which is one of the problems. I don't know if it's generic, but it certainly for special schools has been a bit of an issue because there are a lot of TA.
Yeah, so the core school budget grant allocations were intended to cover at a national level for an average school, noting that bit to start with, intended to cover the cost of both the teacher pay award and the support staff pay awards for last financial year. So that was the intention in them. How schools will have experienced that differently, because schools will have different staffing structures, different levels of vacancies. It's like per pupils per member of staff, etc., different levels of support staff. But that was the intention, that allocation that was made through the core school budget grant was sufficient to largely cover the cost of both the support staff and the teacher pay increase for 24-25. We don't know about future years, so that the intention of the 24-25-26 budget would be that would be sufficient to cover pay awards. That hasn't been the case over the last few years, hence all these bits of additional grants that have been announced. We won't know whether there's any additional grants for the 25-26 pay awards until further down the line when there's been actual decisions made about those pay awards, and then at government level they've made their decisions about affordability of that within the existing funding envelopes. So the answer is we don't know for next financial year.
So the second element is that with the nominal 1 billion across the UK for high needs, is there a likelihood, or do you think there's a possibility that the baseline funding for special schools, which has been stuck at 10k forever, might finally be about to move upwards a little bit, because that might be quite useful?
No, so I think that's very unlikely. We haven't had that confirmed yet because we haven't had the operational guidance yet, but I think it's very unlikely that that would be the case. So I think the £10,000 will likely remain as the baseline amount, and therefore any sort of increases in funding would come through top-ups rather than through the baseline. Okay, so moving on to recommendation 3 of the report. So recommendation 3 is asking for, so there's another recommendation for noting, asking forum members to note that should it be necessary to adjust formula values, so the allocations are within the funding available, that the intention would be to continue with the funding formula adjustments that we'd made in previous years. So to make those adjustments first, and then if necessary, consider other options in terms of capping and scaling or adjusting other formula factors. We need to still work that all through, so we don't have the data to be able to work that through at this stage. So any adjustments would be reported to information for forum in the January. But if we just want to pick up some of the principles around that briefly today. So at the bottom of page 19, in items 15 and 16, it describes the adjustments that we've made in previous years and we propose continuing. So Ealing's local formula currently substantially mirrors the national funding formula, so it's counted as substantially mirroring it and being close to it, which is not the position for all local authorities, but that's been the position in Ealing for a number of years now. That means there are restrictions on how far from the national funding formula we can be. So we can only make adjustments up to plus or minus 2.5% to any particular factor within that. Those adjustments, the reason for adjustments is to reflect two things. So it's either to reflect decisions taken by forum, so decisions taken around things like the growth fund, the 0.5% transfer, the minimum funding guarantee, some of those factors that effectively decisions that are made in terms that impact the overall block, and required for affordability. So the other reason that you can have an affordability gap is because the funding's lagged. So the total envelope of funding that the local authority receive is based on position a year prior, so the October 23 position, and then but we pay out to schools based on the October 24 position. So those two different things can lead to affordability gaps, and the way that we've adjusted the formula in the past is set out in point 15 and 16 of the formula. So those adjustments have been made to the deprivation and low prior attainment factors within the formula, with a small adjustment to the basic per pupil entitlement. There's a diagram on page 18 which kind of sets out the national funding formula factors. So there are a number of other factors within the funding formula around mobility and pupils with English as additional language, for example, and also a lump sum amount. So there are other things that could be adjusted and may potentially need to be adjusted. Part of the reason we would propose continuing with the adjustments we've made in the previous year is partly so there's not a larger than expected drop in any of those other factors. So where they've been adjusted in previous years, that adjustment, if that adjustment continues, you're still seeing an increase in those factors in line with the increase in the national funding formula. The other reason, there's another couple of reasons for recommending that. So if we were to instead cap gains, the schools that would likely be most affected by that are schools who've seen increases in deprivation, because such a large amount of the funding comes through deprivation, or schools who've seen falling rolls, where effectively the lump sum is becoming a bigger part of their funding, so they're seeing a larger than average increase. So our feeling is that that's not where you would want to make the adjustments. And then the other reason is because if we were at the way the minimum funding guarantee works, if we were to make larger adjustments to the basic pupil entitlement, the likelihood is it would bring more schools into being protected by the minimum funding guarantee. So that's the reasons. We did have quite a detailed discussion about the rationale behind that this time last year. It was this time last year for forum members who were part of the forum at that stage. So any kind of comments or thoughts from forum members to inform our thinking around that.
Thanks, Ken. That's a very thorough explanation of something that's quite complicated. I think that it's important to note that historically Forum has set the minimum funding guarantee at a lower level because we were trying to avoid adjustments to things like free school meals, IDACI, the deprivation factors, low prior attainment. And the higher we set the minimum funding guarantee, the more of a reduction is likely to those factors. And I think sticking with the principle, right, which I think is the most important, but sticking with the principle of setting a low minimum funding guarantee to protect vulnerability factors for schools, I think is absolutely the right decision. So I would support continuing along that line.
A lot to take in. Anybody got anything, want to add anything to that? I think as Jeremy, sorry, Susan, you guys? I think as Jeremy said, and as we've discussed before, the centers around the principle of how we approach this for setting this minimum funding guarantee. So I think that's if we can kind of move towards a decision around the principles, that would be important.
Okay, so if we just, so the next recommendation, we're going to come to the minimum funding guarantee in a bit more detail in recommendation 5. So recommendation 4 was just to note and consider the responses received in the funding consultation. We'll pick up the kind of detailed responses around each area as we get to the recommendation rather than picking them all up now, but just to note on this one that we had 20 schools respond to the consultation. So to thank those schools that did respond and encourage their colleagues to respond. We had 12 maintained primaries, 3 maintained secondaries, 2 maintained specials, 1 of the pros and 2 academies respond to that. So the views of that group of schools are then reflected in each of the different sections under the recommendations. So the 4th recommendation is the one we've just started to talk about, which is to agree the value of the 5th recommendation, to agree the value of the minimum funding guarantee, to enable schools' budgets to remain as close to the national formula funding as possible. So this is the proposal. It's set out on page 20 to 21. So what a minimum funding guarantee is a national requirement to protect schools from major real-time funding reductions in their per pupil funding between years. So schools may still see a reduction in their overall funding because of a reduction in pupil numbers. This is not protecting against that, it's protecting against a reduction in the per pupil funding. Forum may take a decision on this, on where to set the minimum funding guarantee within a range set by the government. So in recent years, that range has been a positive range, and the decision by Forum has been to set the minimum funding guarantee at the lowest permissible level. At the time of writing the report, we didn't know what that range was. It has subsequently been announced that that range for this year will be between minus 0.5% and 0. So the maximum we could set it at would be 0, which would mean schools wouldn't see a reduction in their per pupil funding. The minimum we can set that out is minus 0.5, which would mean that any schools who lose through the national funding formula would be protected to a level of minus 0.5% less than what they received per pupil last year. The key thing to note here is that a minimum funding guarantee, so setting the minimum funding guarantee at the lowest permissible level allows us to keep as close to the national funding formula as possible. Setting it at a higher level than that means that further adjustments to the national funding formula will need to be made than the minimum would require. In the consultation of the 20 responses, 17 schools supported setting it at the lowest amount, 1 didn't support, 2 were unsure. And then the comments that came out from schools set there. Last year, 8 schools were protected by the minimum funding guarantee, and the adjustment that required was just under £250,000. Last year, if we'd set that at the highest, the top of what we could have set it at, that would have effectively doubled the adjustment that would have needed to have been made, so it would have been near £500,000. Because of the levels of increase in the formula factors this year being lower, so the minimum funding guarantee will be applied having taken account of rolling in grants into the baseline. So those increases in the formula factors from rolling in the grants aren't going to be part of that minimum funding guarantee. So it effectively would protect against schools who saw a per pupil drop after that was taken into account. Because of the relatively low increase in formula factors, aside from that rolling in of grants, we would anticipate that even setting that at the lowest permissible rate is likely to mean more schools protecting more schools than last year, and setting it at the higher rate would potentially require quite a significant adjustment. We don't have the detailed information to model that through yet, but what we were wanting forum members to comment and consider and hopefully make a decision on around some of the principles around that.
Jimmy?
Yeah, so while personally I think I'm minded to agree minus 0.5% because of all the reasons you've outlined, I think it's important to make the point, like I made earlier, that when this consultation came out, for the past few years, the minimum has been 0%. So it may well have been assumed by the respondents that the minimum would be 0 again, and they voted in favour of 0, not realising that it could be a negative number. And I think we need to be minded that, through no one's fault, the consultation was sent out before we knew it could be a minus number, just saying to the lowest possible. Some people might have answered assuming the lowest possible increase would be 0 by virtue of semantics. So I just think we need to be aware of that if we're making any decisions in this meeting. But personally, I would go for minus 0.5.
I mean, I suppose you could say that the principle behind the previous figure was the lowest possible amount. So the principle is the lowest possible amount, not the number. The principle is the lowest possible amount, not the number.
Some people might assume the lowest possible percentage is 0. And that you can't have a negative percent. I'm arguing semantics, but when you answer questionnaires, you've got to be careful how you word the question or whatever. And it might just be that for the last few years, it's always been 0 that's the lowest. People might have just assumed by agreeing to the lowest, they're agreeing to 0, and they may vote differently if they realise it could be a negative number. They may not. They may still agree, but we don't know that is the point I'm making.
So I think that's helpful feedback, and this year's been a bit unique timescales wise with the election, but we'll think about the wording of the question going forward, and clearly there'll be more recent experience of it being a negative as we move into future years. I think that principle and the linkage between the 2 recommendations, I think it was 5 and 3 maybe, yeah, 5 and 3 is an important one. So the principle of remaining close to the national funding formula was agreed and has been agreed over a number of years. And the premise behind that is that the national funding formula shifted significant amounts of funding through generic kind of ARPU factors into deprivation, mobility, low prior attainment factors, so more complex cohorts of young people. And so in making that decision, Ealing has stuck close to the national funding formula to ensure the most possible funding is diverted into those schools to reflect the cohorts. A decision around the minimum funding guarantee is an important one and potentially more material over time, but there are a number of schools in Ealing who do not have a level of funding that reflects the demographics within that school. So there are a handful of schools that have been protected over a longer period of time, and the actual funding available to them would reduce over time through any ordinary circumstance. And so the government is creating an environment where boroughs are being put in a position, and forums, where the expectation is that they should be moving towards the national funding formula. And so that's why the recommendation of officers, even with it being negative, is still that forum should agree that, if you're sticking to the principles you've already agreed in relation to how you want to invest the maximum amount of funding into those areas.
Could we translate that into an amount? Most people around the table may know. How much money does it represent if we went for minus 0.5 compared to 0 in terms of a pupil in cash terms? Because 0.5% feels kind of interesting, but I don't know what it means.
So last year, 0.5% would have been another £250,000.
So what for an individual pupil at a school? I'm just trying to get my head around the scale of a school who's got 800 pupils. How much would it be for them as that's as, say, others may understand it because they're closer to the day-to-day running of school.
I think it's probably, if we're trying to get a sense of the materiality, the minimum funding guarantee could be a matter of hundreds of pounds for one school, or it could be £100,000 for one school. And so looking at it in isolation of kind of what that would mean on average per child, that wouldn't probably be a representation of what you're trying to tease out. So some schools have historically had, so prior to the national funding formula, were funded at a level well in excess of the national funding formula. And over time, the minimum funding guarantee has only marginally reduced their funding towards the national funding formula. So historically, for a number of years, it was minus 1.5%. And so you'd see that going down over time. More recently, it's been set at positive 0.5%, 0. So not moving those schools towards the national funding formula, kind of retaining a position where they're funding at very historic levels, which were 10 and more years ago, when there were different types of grant funding arrangements. And so that's why some of those values were higher over time. That has reduced as the demographics within schools have shifted. So some of those schools have become more deprived over time, and so they've moved through the mix of children that they have and the funding formulas, the factors they attract more closely to the national funding formula. So it does shift over time. I think an important point to note, which we touched on very briefly in the pre-meeting, is that the increase in deprivation year on year has stabilised much more so this year than we've seen in previous years, and there have been very significant increases over the last 4 or 5 years every year around FSM and FSM6 factors. That's levelled off to some extent this year, so we're in a more steady state from a funding formula perspective. It may not be the experience of individual schools, but that's what the data shows. And so that is part of the going to be part of the challenge with the minimum funding guarantee this year, that there will be more schools that are kind of hovering around the national funding formula amount, which will have smaller adjustments in their demographics and will drop just into the minimum funding guarantee or just outside of it. So there's likely to be many more schools included.
Okay.
So that item is for a decision. So recommendation 5 is for a decision, and that's for forum members.
Yeah. Recommendations that agree? Or
Yeah.
not? Okay.
So recommendation 5 is for forum to agree the value of the minimum funding guarantee, and the value proposed is the minus 0.5%, which is the lowest possible value, which keeps schools as close as possible to the national funding formula.
So can we come to a consensus on this recommendation? So our forum members, we need to take a vote that our forum members minded to agree the MFG at 0.5%, minus 0.5%. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, okay, agreed. Do we move on? Yeah, and what about our online colleagues? Don't see any hands objecting. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so we've agreed.
Okay, so recommendation 6 is to note an update on the DSG management plan, and there's a decision within this to agree to transfer the 0.5% from the schools block to the high needs block. So the approximate value of that this year is around 1.65 million, and this is something that all forum members would vote on. So the detail of this recommendation is set out on page 21 of the report. So there's some, at the time, well, still, the high needs block allocations 25-26 haven't yet been published, but we do have some more. Oh, sorry. So what's been announced to date, so what was announced as part of the budget announcements was that there would be an additional £1 billion to high needs this year. Around half of that funding relates to decisions that they'd already announced around continuation of grants to support with pay awards and the teacher pension increases. Another 150 million of that relates to increases in numbers. So because part of the funding formula for high needs is based on the number of children in special schools, both state funded and independent, and that's increasing. So they need more. There's more funding required to fund that. But there is still some additional funding going into high needs, and a little more than we were perhaps anticipating. So we were anticipating that we might again see a 2% increase in that funding. Based on what they've announced to date, we haven't got our allocation yet, but based on what they've announced to date in terms of the funding floor, we actually think that's going to be more like 5% increase this year. So it is probably something in the region of an additional 2.5 million more than we were anticipating the high needs block might be. But the high needs block is currently in a deficit. So as we reported in the July meeting, the high needs block deficit is around 3 million. The overall deficit on the DSG is just under £2 million at the end of last financial year. In the current year, as at Q2, the net in-year overspend is projected to increase significantly to around 7 million. So taking the cumulative position to something in the region of 9 million by the end of this financial year. So there's work around kind of one-off mitigations for that might reduce that slightly, but we're anticipating that high needs block deficit will increase and continue to be a considerable pressure. So if we see a sort of £3 million increase in the high needs block, we're still anticipating an in-year deficit of in the region of 5 million at least, adding to a cumulative deficit that we've already seen this year. So there is still considerable pressure on that high needs block, and while the additional funding announced helps a little bit, it is closing a gap rather than eliminating a gap. That position, so over I think 6 or 7 years now, I think it might be the 7th year, forum members have agreed. So the regulations enable or allow, with forum member agreement, up to 0.5% of the schools block to be transferred to the high needs block. And that's been a decision that forum members have continued to approve for the last, so 6 or 7 years. So it would be a continuation of an existing agreement. And the recommendation is that that forum members to continue to agree that. With regards to an update on the DSG management plan, so as Ealing are now in an overall deficit on the dedicated schools grant, there's a sort of additional requirements on us in terms of reporting to the ESFA and in terms of working towards a DSG management plan that starts to sort of a mitigated plan in terms of how we'll control that deficit. That's a sort of working document at the moment. We met with the ESFA last week and had some conversations around what that looks like. At the moment, that mitigated plan, so there's a mitigated plan to bring the high needs block back into a surplus position, but the sort of earliest we think that is potentially possible if all the kind of mitigations are able to be taken forward is 28-29. So we expect that high needs block deficit is going to continue to increase for a number of years. And then the mitigations that are then kind of factored into that plan are the things sort of set out in the strategy. So increase early intervention, reduce use of independent schools, strengthen step down, and a significant capital programme to deliver state sector places. So a lot of them, and there's a lot of sort of kind of challenges and risks in terms of taking forward those mitigations. So the intention is to bring more detail on the DSG management plan back to subsequent meetings of the forum. But at this meeting, the decision is around whether forum members are minded to continue agree to continue the transfer. In terms of the responses from the consultation, so of the 20 responses, 18 supported continuing with the transfer, and one actually advocated increasing the amount. So in terms of increasing the amount, actually 0.5% is the highest amount the forum members can agree without a disapplication to the Secretary of State, which is not what we're currently recommending. So we're recommending the maximum kind of allowable as a forum decision. That the comments that came back from expressed sort of concerns that school budgets are already under considerable pressure. Another school sort of advocated clawing back from surplus balances, which we'll talk about the responses to the questions on balances later on, but that wasn't something that other schools in the consultation supported, clawing back from changing that mechanism considerably, which is what would be needed if you were going to claw back a significant amount of money from that. So as I say, for schools that responded to the consultation were largely supportive of continuing with the approach that forum members have agreed in previous years and continuing with that 0.5%.
So forum members, any quick questions, or do we want to move to agree the 0.5 transfer? Jamie?
Yeah, can I just ask a quick question on whether forum has any I don't know, power in knowing how well the recovery plan is going forwards? Because like it strikes me that, you know, overwhelmingly people are going to vote for this transfer. So, you know, I'm not saying that I'm not going to vote for the transfer, but obviously it stings a little bit because as a head teacher, you balance your own budget and it's just tough and you have to make tough decisions and let people go and whatever. And, you know, we've been paying in this 0.5% for 7 years or whatever it was Kim said, and we're likely to be doing it till 28, 29 or something like that. I'm just wondering whether there can be any reporting on us on how it's going and how these mitigations have gone, so that we can feel assured that 28-29 isn't going to turn into 2035 because things haven't gone to plan. Because I think that will keep the will going with head teachers to continue to say yes to the transfer, knowing that there is a plan in place for it not to necessarily be something we always have to do.
So I'm going to bring Aretha in briefly, but just to say the vast majority of the grant, the high needs block, is passed through to schools, and the bits we retain are services that schools receive, like outreach, and so it's not funding officers within the local authority. Those are our statutory duties, and we have general fund budget for that. We do absolutely want schools to be involved in having oversight of the management plan, and that's why it's important that it comes to Forum. Outside of that, schools are involved in our capital programmes, so the school place planning work, involved in the SEND strategy governance as well. And so we can absolutely think about how to engage schools more fully on that. And if you have suggestions around that, we would welcome them. But Aretha, perhaps something around the strategy.
Yeah, I think I echo what you're saying. It's really important that schools have the information come to them in a digestible format. We've had to work really hard on getting a plan together for our ESFA meeting, which is about 40 pages. So it's quite detailed, and it goes through a number of different formulas and a different modelling and staging of, impact of various parts of intervention and what it might do to our budget overall. So what we want to do is condense some of that work and make sure that you've got something digestible to kind of reflect on, and for you to have some reporting throughout the course of the year in terms of what that might look like and what the impact is looking like across all of the work streams we've got going. And it's quite a complex picture, because obviously you can't take one bit of work in isolation and say that's having the impact, because you're doing so much. So actually identifying some of the bits that are the most impactful is going to rely heavily on schools and providers to come back to us and say, well, actually this is working, this is not working, and so we can adjust our plans. So I do think schools Forum and schools in general are a real key part to that recovery plan, because we are relying on the partnership and the collaborative approach, particularly in the realms of early intervention and the work that ELP are doing, to support schools in the system approach, plus some of the work with health, plus some of the work with social care. So it's not an isolated plan, it's an area partnership plan around our DSG and our high needs budget, and particularly around things that will mitigate or reduce the risk of exclusion, suspensions, or lower outcomes for those pupils with SEND. So it's a bit of a bigger picture. Does that answer your question?
Thank you. That's great.
Yeah, I just want to say I've been moaning about this for years about this, the SEND strategy, and there's been lots of turnover at the senior level in the local authority, which I appreciate has made developing a tangible strategy challenging. But let me please just say, it's so wonderful to have you here. Please stay. Please continue the work, because this you've been here a short time. You've had impact already, and it's wonderful to see that. It's going to be really nice to see this moving forward, because the strategy that we've had for many years around how we manage the HCPs and how we fund them and how we support that in schools, I think many of us around the table can agree is for a time gone by, and that a new strategy is needed. And thank goodness you're here. So
I'm just going to manage your expectations a little bit. I don't have a magic wand or anything, but I appreciate your comments, and it was leading into something the other direction for a second there, so thank you. But yeah, I'm really keen to make sure that what we do is done with schools rather than to schools, and the brilliant work that ELP are already doing in galvanising that kind of partnership element and that co-production and that peer collaboration is so important to reducing some of the expend, but also increasing the outputs and outcomes for our children. So thank you.
So can we agree the transfer of 0.5? Any objections? No? Agreed. Thank you.
Okay, so recommendation, where are we up to? 7.
7, yeah.
Is to agree the Sorry. The existing approach for growth funding is to effectively fund that at, in line with the age-weighted pupil unit. So where schools are taking additional bulge classes to meet support with meeting basic need, it's to fund that at the age-weighted pupil unit rate. So, Jeremy?
Yeah, so sorry, Kim. I apologize. I just wanted to, if it's all right, and if not, we can move on. But I just want to go back to point 32, which is a part of the SEND consultation. I'm not sure if it's an inaccuracy or a misunderstanding or an unknown, but I'm not sure that this is completely accurate. And I'm not sure it's for a big discussion here, but I think it needs to be explored through forum around the funding of the 0.5% is allocated to school through top-ups and provision of VHCPs, including outreach. Absolutely, but there's a bit of a gray area here around central services and SEND, specifically the assessment and EP service, through which schools are having to use their top-ups to fund some of those services that are statutory. And so some of it is absolutely being funded by the council's general fund, but I'm completely certain that, you know, schools are also funding statutory work for the local authority that's being sent through that stream. And so again, I don't know if it's, you know, it's not part of that particular consultation, but I think there's some understanding that needs to be had around that, because there's a incongruency with this and what's real, I think.
Yeah, I think in particular it's more aligned with the EP service and the SENAS service, because I don't think there's anything funded by schools from there. But I think you might be talking about the traded element, and the statutory assessment work is for the EPs. Yes. And so one of the things, well, there's two elements of that. The staffing and everything is funded centrally, but there's always an element of traded services for EPs and the like, and that's what schools are paying into. And that allows our EPs to move away from just doing the statutory assessment, but to do some of the proactive work. However, I can see some shakes, but however, there is a shortage of EPs, and there is a increasing numbers of assessments. So the balance of getting that proactive work going and doing the assessments may not be felt in schools, because actually the pressure is the assessments, because we've got a time frame to meet. Sure. Statutory wise. What we are doing though is, so I don't have a sharp answer for you apart from that, but I can tell you what we are doing. This year we've got an EP independent review looking at the EP structure, the service delivery, and what we might need to do in terms of what is actually going to be traded and what does that look like for schools, and what does the capacity need to look like in order to do that. As you know, we've got a mixture of locums and staff that are directly employed by the EP, and that does skew some of the costs, in particular for staffing, because the cost per assessment will rise when we're using locums. So we've got that review, but then also what we're going to do about our workforce long term to make sure that we can meet the demand coming through. Because going back to the previous point about the high needs recovery plan, a lot of it is focused on that early intervention and proactive work, and so we have to address the balance there in order to support schools to deliver some of that.
Yeah, and I think I've, you know, having been in Ealing for quite a long time, I appreciate the strain that's on that service, and I think, you know, I don't think there's probably a head teacher in here who expects the EP service to deliver preventative measures anymore. We're long past that. But what I think where I'm concerned about the gray is the difference between completing an assessment for review for URSA, but the second half of that, once panel has agreed that an EHCP is to be granted, looking at APD's statutory service, which then become, unfortunately, part of the traded service. So if you're a school that does buy in to the Ealing service, well, now you're using your buy-in hours to do statutory work. And if you don't buy into the EP service, you're in a different pile. And I think that there's something around this. I think this needs to be made really clear to schools about what is it that we need to be buying and what is it we shouldn't be buying, because this directly impacts this 0.5% and the larger deficit.
Thanks, Chairman.
So just very briefly on that. So I think as a point of clarification and accuracy, you're right. So trade and general fund and traded service for EP. I think Aretha's work to review and understand the balance of the traded elements and the statutory service will seek to address some of those matters. The funding in the round is the funding available to schools, and so you get into semantics about which bits of funding, what elements of it. Matters for forum, generally speaking, don't include traded services, and so it's probably why it's, rather than it being intentionally missed off, that's why it's just not been referred to, because it's dealt with through other mechanisms. But it's an important point to note. It impacts the deficit management planning. It impacts schools' budgets regardless, because you're making choices about trading, and the purpose of service is important to be clear about. It doesn't directly impact the 0.5%, because children will have plans, children won't have plans. There's notional SEND budgets in the round. The 5% we're getting in is going back out to schools. And so that decision isn't directly linked to the cost of traded elements of services.
I think yes and no. I think that because there are going to be schools, and I think it's about how it's the same pie, but I think it is about how you divide it and which schools feel that more than others. So I think if you're a school that has a buy-in service, so for example, if school A is paying £15,000 a year to buy in, and in that particular year, 14 of that £15,000 is being used for statutory service, well, that's £14,000 that's not being shared by the number of schools that are impacted by this grant. Like, it's felt by one school. And I think that's where it can be challenging. If school B doesn't buy in any of the Ealing service, they're getting the service through this 0.5%.
They're not. So to be absolutely clear, the EP service is funded from the general fund. The largest proportion is from the council's statutory budget, which is not the dedicated schools grant. It's our statutory functions. And the bit that's not funded by the council's general fund is a traded service, which is also not the DSG, but it's funded from schools' budgets and choices individual schools will make. So it's not, there is no proportion of this 0.5% that goes into managing the educational psychology budget. It's a statutory function of the local authority.
Except the bit that goes to schools that are paying for the statutory service.
Those are choices about budgets and all the blocks and various grants, and that, you know, that's in the wash of a school's overarching budget. The biggest amount of budget that schools have is the schools block. But what I want to be absolutely clear about, because it is a regulatory thing as well, there is no DSG that goes into the EP budgets. It's a statutory function or a traded service. It cannot be funded from the DSG. So yes, schools will be making decisions. Yes, you can take a view about whether you're funding it from your schools block or your high needs block, but it's not being funded from the decision of 0.5%.
Sorry, can I just, being brand new again, so if I haven't bought into the EP service, that particular school, how is the ABD assessment being paid for?
So matters for forum are decisions about the dedicated schools grant, and there are wider challenges within the system that are dealt with as part of SEND strategy and decisions both from schools' individual budgets, overarching grants and the council's general fund. The education psychology service is statutory and it's traded. And so I think we've been clear that there's a challenge around the clarity around the balance of that and how to prioritise the very limited resource sets available. But what I'm making clear is that the 0.5% and the 1.6 million that generates in dedicated schools grant high needs that would otherwise remain in the schools block funds high needs top-ups, funds outreach. It does not directly fund the EP service. So if a school receives an overarching budget which include high needs, PPG, notional SEND budget through the schools block, you will be making decisions about whether to buy services or not, which may include EPs, may include other traded services from the local authority. That is separate from this 0.5%, and those are decisions made by individual schools, but we absolutely accept it's important that the purpose of the EP service and what schools are paying for through the traded elements of that service are clear to all parties and the resource that we have is prioritised. So we absolutely don't dispute that part, but what I'm making clear is the 0.5% does not fund the EP service.
And I'm very happy for the minutes to accept that.
Yeah.
I'm not suggesting that the local authority is misappropriating funds.
No.
And I'm not suggesting you're trying to mislead us. But not for the minutes. I don't accept that because I don't have a choice. If I buy in the EP service, this gray area that we're agreeing exists is funding this service. It is absolutely funding it, and it's not my choice. My choice is to buy in service or not. As soon as I've said I'm buying in, well, I've got the EP service calling back saying, okay, well, you don't have any days left this year that you bought in because it all needs to go to statutory work. So the 0.5% that's funding my top up is going right in from my budget, right back to the EP service. And that's what I'm saying. I'm not saying any funds are misappropriated or things that I wholeheartedly accept that. But as soon as we made the choice to buy in, we've made the choice to fund the EP service statutory work now, not just the assessments and the lead up. We have made an active decision in doing that, which isn't clear to schools, to fund that service. And I think that through your work, I think is going to be really, really clear. And as I said, for the minute, I'm very happy to. But I think the reality is that 0.5% is definitely funding the EP service, just through a back door.
Yeah. So I don't think it's, ultimately we're not disagreeing, but to be clear, schools have a budget that is formed of many budgets, not just this 0.5%, not just the high needs block. And so it's a decision as part of an overall schools budget. But the points that you're making still are accurate in terms of the purpose of the service and how it's funded needs to be cleared.
I just want to make a point, the same for speech and language therapy. Like children have EHCP plans with statutory speech and language therapy hours, like 12 or 13.5 hours. And we're not getting that. We're having to buy in privately to get that done because there isn't that availability. And this has been happening for years.
So the local authority funds the bits that are in the plan, and that's through a contract that we have centrally, and that's funded from the high needs block. So that is funded by the high needs block. Statutory assessment work and the capacity of the NHS to deliver that is a matter for the NHS, but it is a challenge for them, and it's part of the broader partnerships arrangements to ensure that they're delivering their statutory duties. That's not a duty of the local authority, and it doesn't form part of, while you may be making decisions again from your budgets, that's not a decision that relates to the dedicated schools grant.
Okay, so good discussion. I think that there's a little bit of further work to be done on the clarity of this, and perhaps that could be picked up in the send and inclusion. I know the remit of the send and inclusion, whatever it is, committee, the L committee. So, not so much the partnership board, but the committee could do a little bit of work, because we are moving off. It is a grey area, as you say, Jeremy, and we're sort of moving on to a kind of send discussion, which is very pertinent. But I do think from a school's point of view, the more clarity we bring to this issue, the more informed schools will be. Because it does, I can see that there is a potential to blur the boundaries here, and I think that's what people are concerned about. So it's an important discussion that I think needs to just have further clarification on. Okay.
Okay, coming back to the growth fund, where we were. We did that. So yeah, just coming back to the growth fund. So we receive, as part of the schools block, we receive an allocation from the government for growth, which is based on the increases that are seen at small area level within the local authority from 1 October census to the next. We don't know what that growth fund allocation is yet, but based on the sort of calculations we've done on the census numbers, we anticipate that that's going to be lower than it was last year. So last year it was around 1.5 million. We think it's going to be something closer to 1.1 million this year. We're still seeing growth pressures, so we are still needing to agree bulge classes. Two main areas that we're currently needing to agree bulge classes at the primary sector in Acton. So in Acton, we're seeing quite a different picture than we're seeing in the rest of the borough. So in the rest of the borough, we're seeing falling roles, we're seeing an increasing number of vacancies. In Acton, we're in a position where actually the majority of schools are full, and we're having to agree additional bulge classes to enable us to meet in-year demand. Some of the responses coming through the consultation were around, could that demand not be met through schools with vacancies? So to kind of make clear on that, where that's a reasonable distance, we would do that. But what we've seen is demand that actually without putting in those growth fund, those bulge classes, we wouldn't be able to meet within a reasonable distance. So within a mile up to 1.5 miles is sort of at primary considered a reasonable distance. And so we have had to agree bulge classes in a number of year groups in Acton at primary. The other place we're still needing to agree bulge classes is in secondary year groups, so particularly in years 8 to 10 in secondary. The rules changed around growth funding year before last to say, and this was something Ealing were already doing, but to say that actually where we're asking a school to put on an additional class, even if that's within their planned admission number, that should be funded through the growth fund. So that was something we had always done in Ealing, but that was made statutory through the funding regulations year before last. So we are still seeing those pressures and agreeing with a small number of secondary schools and a small number of primary schools in the Acton area. And we anticipate that we will still need to do that into next financial year. The local authority received 20 responses to the consultation on how we should respond if that allocation that we receive in the schools book isn't sufficient to fund growth. The recommendation was that we continue with the current rules and continue to fund at a rate equivalent to the basic age-weighted pupil unit rate. 90% of schools agreed with that, continuing with that approach. So that's the recommendation. The other bits around the growth fund, so we've recommended an additional criteria into the growth funds this year. So as well as the basic kind of per pupil funding through bulge classes, we've always had 2 additional criteria in there to enable some additional funding for schools where they're having large building works, or in very exceptional cases where they're putting on a bulge class and needing additional revenue funding to enable them to do that. We're proposing adding an additional criteria in for 25-26. So the growth fund guidance has been updated to enable local authorities to use the growth fund to support mainstream schools with meeting the revenue costs of repurposing surplus places. So not the capital costs, the revenue costs of doing that. And the proposed criteria that we're proposing adding is set out on page 24, item 40. So where a mainstream school is developing a specialist resource provision or a designated unit, funding leadership capacity of up to £20,000 a year for up to 4 terms before opening, plus funding the cost of the lead teacher for that resource provision a term in advance of opening. So the recommendation is that where schools are developing specialist resource provision, that additional funding is funded through the growth fund allocation. And 75% of responses to the consultation agreed with adding that criteria. There were a number that were unsure, and some of the unsure bits were around whether that rate would be adjusted based on the expansion programme. So just to clarify, the criteria in the growth fund isn't up to, and that would be the case that actually it would be dependent on the project and the needs of the school up to that level. And then the other bit in here, so if we take it all kind of together because it all interrelates, is around the falling role fund. So local authorities can set aside a falling role fund, and what a falling role fund is a small fund that could provide additional funding to a school with falling roles. But there's a number of sort of conditions on that criteria, and the key condition to that is that actually we'd only be able to allocate that out to schools if there was a if the projections showed that those places would be needed again within the next 3 years. And at the moment, that's not the position in the projections at primary school. particularly, where we're seeing the largest kind of impact of falling roles. So therefore, we could allocate a fund, a pot of money, and then not be able to allocate it out. And there are a number of, in terms of actual how you would allocate that out, even if that was the position. I think there's some quite challenging things that you would need to navigate in having a falling role fund. The government now provide local authorities with falling role funding if they're seeing a 10% or more reduction at small area level in either primary or secondary. Last year, we didn't get any funding through that. This year, we actually do expect to get some funding through that. So not confirmed yet, but there are 2 areas at high school where we have seen a greater than 10% reduction. So we do expect to see some funding through that, but actually then allocating that out, the schools in those secondary schools in those areas that have seen the falling roles are actually the schools that we're allocating additional funding through the growth fund through. So our recommendation would be not to separately set aside a falling role fund, but to use any additional funding we get through that to supplement the growth fund allocation to enable us to continue with the growth fund rules. So that's the kind of 3 sort of recommendations and decisions for Forum are around continuing with the approach in terms of how we allocate out growth funding, but where there's bulge classes, having that additional criteria to supporting revenue costs where schools are adding special resource provision, and not introducing a falling role fund.
So, okay with that? Do we all understand what's going on? More people are losing the will to live on that. The recommendation is to agree the basis for allocating funding for the growth fund, and then to not proceed with the falling role.
Can I just ask one question around the growth fund? You mentioned about place allocations and the possibility of looking at that. I noticed that Arc Acton are reducing significantly and Arczone growing significantly. Is there any way that that can be mitigated, because they're getting quite a large chunk, obviously, of growth fund there?
So Arczone is filling, and to some extent that's preventing children attending schools outside of the borough rather than drawing children away from Arc Acton, and so the broad balance is what you might expect. We have needed to put a large number of growth bulge classes and allocate growth fund to 2 high schools in the borough, and primarily that's been in relation to arrivals from abroad and wider mobility rather than main round admissions and the choices that families are making. So where we can, we agree with schools and manage it as flexibly as possible and only take forward bulge classes where they're needed or there's a high likelihood of needing them. But we've needed both the places at Arczone and at Arc Acton over that period of time.
Han?
I think the NEU's prediction about what was going to happen with Arczone and Arc Acton is being validated as we speak.
Thanks, Stefan.
Can I ask something about the falling role funds? If we decide not to go ahead with it, and this is happening to schools, wouldn't it take them some time to kind of, people have plans like redundancies or whatever it is they want to do, but wouldn't it take them some time to enact that plan? And don't they need a bit of a buffer for a year or 18 months or whatever to kind of get that going?
So there's effectively some buffer already in the fact that the funding formula is lagged. So actually, if you've seen a reduction in pupil numbers, the impact of that comes the following year. So the impact of the reduction in funding. So there is a buffer to it. I think the key thing to note about the falling role fund is that actually, unless we were forecasting that numbers are going to go back up, we wouldn't be able to allocate it out anyway because of the requirements on how you can allocate out the funding. So even if we set aside a falling role fund, it couldn't be used to fund a kind of buffer where schools are taking time to reduce their staffing. It wouldn't, unless it would be around protecting a school to retain those staffing for when numbers start coming back up again, which, as I say, isn't currently the trajectory at primary.
Can I just ask,
Jeremy.
if we set it aside and we couldn't allocate, what would happen to it then? We would just give it back to something, wouldn't we?
It would be unspent, and then it would come back to Forum for effectively in the summer, in the same way that the reserves and underspends do, for a decision about how to use it.
Okay.
So can we vote to agree for allocating funding for the growth fund and not introduce falling roll fund? Okay, everybody? Yeah. Okay, that's agreed.
Okay. Sorry, recommendation 8 is around the education functions funding. So this is an item for maintained schools members only to vote on. The detail of this is set out on pages 25 and 26 of the report. So effectively the recommendation here is that we agree to increase the rate of education function funding to £38.15. So it's £36.69 in 24-25, and the recommendation is that increases to £38.15 in 25-26, which is broadly a 4%. So it's a 4% increase. So it's broadly in line with pay inflation for those areas. So there, as we mentioned earlier, there is a reduction in pupil numbers. So of around, what did I say, around 600. So that does impact the amount of funding that comes through the education functions, because it's a per pupil level. So that is equivalent to around £25,000 less education functions funding than we would have had if we'd had the same pupil numbers as the previous year. The proposal is to maintain the overall value, the £38.15, which is what we set out in the consultation, which is the 4% increase on that value, but effectively to adjust the line by line values to ensure that the budgets have an increase that is an increase that reflects the pay pressure, and to manage the pressure within the statutory and regulatory duties line, which is the largest amount of money and covers sort of a range of different functions. So that's what, so the breakdown that's set out here is slightly different than was set out in the funding consultation for that reason, because at the time we didn't know about the reduction in the pupil numbers. So it's the same overall amount that was in the funding consultation. It's just slightly different in terms of how it's set out across the lines. Of the respondees, so there were 17 responses to this, because the question only goes to maintained schools, and 15 supported the funding at £38.15. So whatever's that, 88% supported that. And so yes, so school forum members are asked to approve the proposed rates per pupil and effectively agree the line by line breakdown as set out in the report.
Presumably the people who were the two that voted against aren't saying they don't want to fund it at all. They just don't want it to fund the increase, actually, because we can't not fund it. Or I suppose my second question is, if we didn't fund it, what would happen? How would these things get done?
Yeah, so there were a number of comments that came from those schools, some of which actually related to specific issues for the particular schools that responded that I've addressed with that school. One of the schools queried about the core school improvement funding, which is something that we sort of discussed and at length when that was added into the education functions, and not something that's sort of any kind of changes to that. It would make sense to pick those up as part of the what's the word I want, the like re-looking at the ELP contract when that comes through and the functions, rather than something to make any changes to at this rate. As I say, the majority of schools supported the overall rate being as set out, and yeah, if these weren't funded through education functions, effectively they would need to be funded in other ways through traded arrangements.
Can I just ask about the core school improvement functions, which has gone up 7.5%, 8%, but help has played an incredible role the last few years. Schools are getting better, more outstanding schools, more, lots of really great schools. I just am interested in why we're spending more money on school improvement.
So the reason for the increase as it's but a lot of the staff that are funded through that are funded at the teacher pay rate.
Yeah.
So the increase that you were trying to reflect is the 5.5% increase, and the pupil numbers reduction. So that's why it's a higher increase. It's because it's taking into account the pupil number reduction and aiming to fund the 5.5%. So it's funding pay inflation, not anything additional, if that makes sense.
And maybe for Julie, but would we expect over time to see a reduction in that service with the success of ELP, or it's at the minimum already?
I mean, it is a very minimum amount, and we based it, I think, on our programme of health checks, which we do kind of proportionately every 3 years for most primary special schools, and an estimate that are probably around 9 to 10 schools per year would need some kind of additional support. At the moment, certainly as of today, we've only got 6 schools in the programme, so that's a great signifier. And if we compare it to 2012, it was nearer 20. So it is, I suppose if we were in a perfect world, we wouldn't need this. We wouldn't need this funding. But I think it is the kind of backstop, the security that we need to make sure that when schools do have fragilities, that we have a system there ready to support and pick them up, and to identify risks early enough to do something about it.
Okay.
That's so just to clarify for those online, Marion just made reference to us ensuring we capture the votes of the people online.
Okay, so are we okay to agree just get the actual recommendation to agree the education functions, it's number 8, isn't it?
Yeah.
Agree the education functions for maintained schools.
Any named or maintained school numbers?
Yeah, Chris, yeah, okay. Okay, agreed. We need to, could I just say, I absolutely do not want to stifle discussion and debate, absolutely not. But it's a very involved process, and I think people are getting tired. So if we could sort of just swiftly move through explanations and discussions, otherwise I think we will seriously lose the will to live over this. And it's a lot of information for people to absorb. So if we can really move through this swiftly.
Okay, so recommendation 9 is around agreeing the dedelegation of certain services. So in accordance with voting requirements, these are separate decisions for maintained primary schools and maintained secondary schools. These are set out on pages 26 to 28 of the report. So the recommendation is to continue with the existing dedelegations, which are contingencies, trade union facility time, assessment of free school meal eligibility, and for primary schools, behaviour support services. The recommendation was that we continue with those, so contingencies continue with that at the current rates, and for the other areas continue with that with an increase to cover the pay awards. What we've done in the, so it was a sort of in principle item in the school funding consultation, and the majority of schools, so contingency, majority of schools agreed with keeping that at the existing rate. The trade union facility time, 58% of schools supported that. free school meal eligibility, 100% of schools supported it, and the primary behaviour service, 94% of schools supported it. The rates that are proposed, the rates that would be needed to fund those pay awards, so they take into account the fact that there's a slightly smaller number of pupils. So that's why it's the budgets that are increasing in line with the pay inflation. So, and largely that's because those budgets fund a small number of staff in those cases. So that's what the rates are set out to do, to fund the pay awards in those areas. So has anyone got any comments on those areas?
Before we move to green line by line. I'm looking, Marion, at the online. Okay, so contingencies. Yes. Trade union facilities. Yes. Oh, that's primary. Trade union primary. Yes. Trade union secondary. Yep. Secondary maintained. Okay, no disagreement. Free school meals. Yep. And behaviour support services. Thank you. Let's move on quickly, Kim.
Okay, so recommendation, where are we up to? 10 is to approve the centrally retained expenditure on a line-by-line basis. So this is set out on pages 29 and 30. So there are two elements to this. There are there's the central school services block excluding the historic commitments, and then there's the historic commitments. So for historic commitments, so that budget is continuing to reduce, the historic commitments budget. So we haven't known it at the time of writing the report, but it's subsequently been confirmed that that budget continues to reduce by 20% per year. So the recommendation there is to apply that reduction proportionately to each of the areas that are covered by those historic commitments. And that was supported by 90% of schools responding to the consultation. The central school services block, so the recommendation here, we don't know the exact block total yet, so that will be announced whenever they make their funding announcements. So the indicative values set out here are based on the existing budget for this year, with a small adjustment for the two things that we do know, which is that pupil numbers have gone down slightly, but that we're receiving some more income for copyright licenses because those have gone up in cost. So that's why there's a slight adjustment to those numbers. There are also some adjustments between lines that we're recommending. So these adjustments between lines are effectively formalising things that have already happened in terms of areas where costs have reduced and areas where there are pressures within that. So we're realigning within the existing central school services block. It isn't an additional pressure. It's still around containing within the block, but realigning to fund those areas with pressures and taking the budget from the areas where we're not spending against that allocation. 18 of the 20 schools who responded, so 90% again, supported allocating as it's set out in table 7. If there is an increase in the rates and the actual block is higher, we would revert to Schools Forum in January for a decision as to where to allocate that additional funding. So the decision for this meeting is around making those 20% reductions proportionately to the historic commitments and funding and allocating the central school services block as set out in the table on page 29.
Okay, so we need to agree or disagree line by line. Yep. Yep.
Okay, so I mean, I think is there any objections rather than going through the line by line? Is there anything anyway?
Yeah, so this is. So as Kim mentioned, set out the consultation document, the overall allocation is passed through to the local authority. This is correcting and realigning based on where the spend is already happening. So the stat and reg duties includes things around admissions attendance, officers that manage the school funding arrangements, and wider school strategy and infrastructure planning. So there are a bunch of things in there. It's not to spend more on them. There are existing levels of spend. There are historic amounts that have been allocated around independent schools fees for children without SEN. That is no longer a risk to the local authority. Children in independent schools funded by their families, the local authority doesn't contribute to that unless they have a top up, and we fund the specific top up, not the wider fees.
Any objections to education welfare, asset management, statutory and regulatory duties? Oh, sorry, I'll do that again. Any objections to education welfare, asset management, stat and regulatory duties? School admissions, fees to independent schools without SEN, which is nothing. And other items, including copyright licenses. Okay.
Okay, and then
we move to historic commitments, which is just 30. SAFE, parenting services, parenting service interventions for challenging behaviour, lack teaching service, and historic commitment savings transferred to high needs. Any objections? Okay, agreed.
Okay, so recommendation 11 is just a quick one to note the composition of the notional SEN budget. So this is on page, that's the right page, 31 of the report. So there's no proposed changes to this. So this is how it's been allocated for a number of years. The notional SEN budget, just to remind colleagues, is a notional amount within schools' overall budget allocations towards the cost of fulfilling schools' duties to use their best endeavours to secure special educational needs provisions for pupils with SEN. So it's not a separate budget, it's an identified amount within schools' budgets. And as I say, the Ealing's notional SEN budget is kind of in line with national recommendations on how we do that, and we're proposing just continuing with what's happened in previous years on that.
Can I just ask how low prior attainment's calculated now that there's no early assessment of children?
So for lots of the children, that will be calculated based on there is still low prior attainment data, because those children are children who are moving through. So at secondary, it's based on Key Stage 2 outcomes. At primary, it's been based on early years foundation stage outcomes. So it never was based on Key Stage 1 assessment. It was always based on early years foundation stage. And so those children have still got those outcomes, and they're moving through. Okay, so that was just an item for noting. Item, whatever we're up to now. The next one. 12 is around noting the progress around the implementation of the 23-24 balance control mechanism. So we had a discussion at the June meeting when forum members made the decision to implement the balance control mechanism for 23-24 balances, and forum members requested that this be an item for the consultation if schools were interested, like what schools' views were on changing that mechanism. So it applied to either a larger number of schools or a larger proportion of budgets for the schools it did apply to. So just before we come to the consultation responses, in terms of the progress towards applying the balance control record for last year, so there were 4 schools that were potentially in scope for that, as set out in the July forum report. Those schools have been written to. 2 of those schools have, following review of balance mechanism forms, have come out of scope of that, so no longer met the criteria for it. So there's 2 remaining schools in scope. It's a small amount of money this year, so it's 0. What's that? So it's 10 grand across the 2 schools, and so we'll. I think they currently the position is in terms of schools making representations back on that, and then we'll update Forum further on the progress on that in the January meeting in terms of actually implementing that. The consultation question asks schools if about their views on 2 elements of the balance control mechanism. So one of those was around increasing the incremental levels. So it effectively, the schools that are in scope for the clawback, a larger amount of their balances was clawed back. At the moment, those incremental levels are quite small. So it's a relatively small amount of excess balances that are clawed back from schools that are in scope. And 71% of schools felt that that was something that that they would be minded to support. The second bit was around an increase in the 59% of schools. So 71% of schools supported changing the mechanism. 59% of schools thought that we should increase the amounts clawed back from the small number of schools who are in scope, and a much smaller number of schools, so 24% of the schools thought we should change the mechanism so it applied to at the moment, the mechanism only applies to schools that have got increasing excessive balances. So the question was around whether that sort of condition is taken out and it applies to any school who've got an excess balance. So that was supported by a much smaller number of schools. So I think the ask for Forum is to note the consultation responses and agree the action they would like local authorities to take in response to those.
So yeah, this is a kind of important question that you've got 2 minutes to discuss about,
So we can bring this, and it might be worth, given the timing and the length of the meeting, might be worth bringing this back to a discussion in January. So if we were to make a decision, we would need to make that decision in April. The recommendation wasn't to change anything for next financial year. It would be to change it for the following financial year to give schools a chance to kind of act in response to any change. So I suggest we come back to it in the January meeting rather than have a discussion about it now.
No, absolutely. But I think it would be advisable for in your different sectors to have discussions about this so that when we come back to it in January or in April, that we can make an informed decision or a broadly based, if there has been, as Kim said, a consultation, which is an important consultation. The traction was good, but limited. So, I think it would be advisable in your networks to discuss the issue around balance control mechanism and try to garner as much feedback as possible to inform any potential changes or not in January. Marion?
Just in case within those discussions we get asked the question, is there any access that you could get to comparable data or approaches from other boroughs? I'm just thinking that could be a question that would come up. It's like, what are we deciding in isolation here within Ealing that we could maybe learn?
Yeah, so we can, I mean, some boroughs don't have one. So some boroughs don't have a balance control mechanism that they apply. Some have got a very balance control mechanism. There's one that was in the news quite recently where they clawed back the whole of the excess balances from a school who had something like £500,000 worth of excess balances, that it was very controversial. So I think there are a range of approaches out there. We can definitely ask our networks to try and get some examples and a sense of what those look like in other boroughs.
Jeremy?
Yeah, just Kim, for newer members, can you just be really clear about when the balance control mechanism is activated? Because it's not as simple as like you have too much money and they take it back. It's a
so at the moment, the balance control mechanism that we have in Ealing applies to, so excess balances are considered to be over 5% for secondary of their budget for secondary schools and over 8% for primary, nursery and special schools. The balance control mechanism that we have at the moment is applied to schools who have an increasing excess balance over a 3-year control period. So it wouldn't just apply to a school who had who were over that threshold in 1 year. They would have to have been over it and increasing. And then there are incremental levels that it's applied for. So at the moment, it's a certain proportion of any budgets between 9 and 12%, 12 and 15%. So they're incremental levels. So actually the amounts that are clawed back from schools where they have been agreed are generally relatively small in the scheme of the excess budget, and it's more intended, it has been more intended as a deterrent rather than a way of clawing huge amounts of those balances back from schools. It's a decision for Forum in the June-July meeting of the Forum as to whether to implement that each year. So while we have a mechanism in place, that decision is something Forum take as to whether that's implemented each year.
And it's also true to say, isn't it, that we offer them the opportunity to explain why they've got an excess balance, and if they have a plan to spend money in a relatively limited period looking forward, they're not caught by it. So they're not penalised. I think one of the comments that came back was to try and avoid people saying, but you're destroying our future plans that we've got because you're taking some away. I mean,
yeah, so the feedback
that came
back, the feedback that came back about not taking away the increasing in excess bit was around schools where they were saving for something in particular, where it was kind of capital works, and those take longer than being able to be applied in 1 year, which was, I think, some of the feedback that came back around why actually schools were minded to keep that increasing in excess. It's not quite as simple as you said, because all schools that have got excess balances say they've got a plan to use the whole of it the following year or the excess amount. So, but it is taken into consideration that whether the plans that they have are affordable in terms of whether that control mechanism is applied.
Kim, when you mention 8%, 5%, is that the in-year balance or that's the whole thing, including the surplus?
It's the cumulative balance. Yeah. Yeah, so a decision as part of the a decision on the scheme for financing schools, which is where the balance control mechanism sets out, is a decision for the April meeting of the Forum. But what we would like to do is be able to effectively have that discussion and decision about what we might want to put in at the January meeting if possible.
I mean, I think we can bring it up at the January. We should bring it up at the January meeting. I'm not sure of the opportunities for networks to have met to discuss this, because a lot of quadrants would have happened and won't happen till late January, early February. So we will bring it up, and if you can discuss it, and to get to enable sort of feedback loop to happen, but we could also bring it back in the April Forum.
Yep. Okay, thank you. And then just the final recommendation, you'll be pleased to know, is just to note and comment on the arrangements set out in the report on which the council is required to consult School Forum annually. So this is a range of financial issues. These are set out on pages 32 to 34 of the report. These are largely, almost entirely a continuation of previous years' arrangements, so there are no sort of changes within that. So it's just noting in any comments that Forum members have.
At this stage, we'll trust you on that. Thank you, Kim. So that concludes the meeting. I do want to sincerely thank all Forum members, and especially the new ones, for wading through a number of technical information. It is a lot that the November Forum is very heavily weighted with. So thank you for your forbearance and for the really insightful discussion. And yeah, bed down for the winter, everybody. And you know, thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Paul.
Wow.
Thank you.
Oh, and I do want to thank
you, online colleagues.
Sorry, I do want to
thank
our the online colleagues, but also thank our LA officers who, you know, this is very technical, involved work, and I am very mindful that they're doing this work to support us in schools. So I do want to thank the officers for all of their hard work.
Putting up with our multi-million questions.